Hey everybody, welcome back to Horror Trans. My name is Stephanie Bree. I am a transgender woman. I talk about all things horror, and today I have the uncomfortable, awkward position of telling you about Lisa Frankenstein. Before I get into my reviews, I have some nitpicks with this movie. And I'm going to rant a little bit. Just a little bit because some of the things in this movie kind of took me out of the movie and were kind of a turnoff for me. Not to say I didn't enjoy some things, I did, but I have to be upfront with you. I grew up in the 80s. I was alive in the 80s. I witnessed the 80s firsthand. And so I understand the nostalgia trip an 80s throwback film is supposed to offer us. And I understand right now the 80s are the it thing, Stranger Things, what's that one on ABC, The Goldbergs, and all these fucking 80s throwback movies. There's a bajillion of them. And yes, a bajillion of them. I know that's not a real word, but I use it a lot. So get it in the dictionary. It's a new word. It means an excessive number that's hard to quantify, but excessive. That's what bajillion means. So there you go. Dictionary people, you're welcome. That's how I use it. Anyways. Alright, so nitpick. I'm gonna do the nitpicks first, and then I'm gonna get into what I liked about it, and then I'm gonna discuss the actual meat and potatoes of the movie. So nitpicks. Alright. I know this is going to sound nitpicky, and it is, but listen, I was alive in 1980, 7, 8, 9. I was there. I witnessed it. I saw it firsthand. I watched 80s movies when they were being made and released and spoon-fed us on TV and in theaters and on video cassette. I was there. I experienced it firsthand. This movie does not capture the 80s fucking at all. This is a surface-level, glossy, fictionalized reimagining of the 80s based on somebody who was probably, I would assume, not there based on what I see in this film, who just has an appreciation of it. And the aesthetic of this movie reminds me of somebody who watched a lot of VH1 I Love the 80s, and they thought, oh, that's what the 80s was, cool, and then they ran with it without having actually experienced it firsthand or ever. If you're going to do a throwback movie like this, do your research. Go back and read some newspapers from the period. Look at some yearbooks from the period. Don't just look at other movies from the period, which, by the way, I don't think this filmmaker referenced 80s movies, or if they did, they referenced the wrong ones. And here's my reasoning behind that. The movie takes place in 1989. We find this out through context clues, but also at the end of the movie, where a date is shown, and it is 1989. But everything you see visually looks like 1986. And I'm sorry, but if you were alive in any decade, 70s, 60s, 90s, whatever, you know that fashions and styles change as the decade progresses. So if you're going to make an 80s throwback movie, or a 90s throwback movie, or whatever, I'm going to nitpick a couple of points. If you're going to, okay, look, the 70s, right? When you think the 70s, you think bell-bottoms and platform shoes. But that was only like 2 years of the 70s. So if you're going to make a 70s throwback movie, and your movie takes place outside the 2 years that bell-bottoms were popular, don't give your cast bell-bottoms. You just don't. Because it's going to be anachronistic, and it's going to take people out of the film. Same thing with this. The bright neon pinks and the frizzy hair and the jean jackets and the poofy skirts, that was 1985, 86, 87. That was the height of the MTV period. 1988, 1989. Go back and look at films released in those years. Go back and look at, news articles from those years, newscasts or TV shows or whatever. The late 80s were a lot more grungier, darker, grittier, grainier than the mid-80s. The early 80s, you couldn't distinguish from the 70s. 80, 81, 82, you could watch a film from those 3 years, and you could be told they were made in the 70s, and you'd be easy to fool. 84 is somewhat the transition year. This is the year of, like, Ghostbusters, Gremlins, The Terminator, some of the big iconic movies. Again, they're not, none of them are frizzy hair, neon lights, fucking poodle skirts, none of that stuff. That comes later. That's 85, 86, 87. You know what I mean? So study the decade before you make a movie set in 1989 that looks like it was made in 1986. And the reason why I harp on that is because it takes me out of the movie. And it does because it's 1989, everything looks like 1986, but they show a flashback to 2 years earlier, which would be 1987, and everything looks the same. There's no distinction. There's no difference in styles or tone or anything between 87 and 89 in this film, which in real life there were huge differences between 87 and 89. So I know I'm nitpicky, and I am, and I don't want you to think that this means I didn't enjoy the movie, because I'm going to talk about the things I liked about it. But I have to harp on this because there's too many 80s throwback movies that just try to do a surface level, remember this thing from the 80s? Yeah. Except it's like, yeah, but your movie takes place in 87, and that thing, or 83, and that thing wasn't made until 87. Or, yeah, your movie takes place in 88, but that thing was no longer popular by 84. So, like, get it right, is all I'm saying. That does take me out of the film. Now, the things I liked, even though I'm harping on it, the aesthetic is beautiful. It's a pretty movie, I will give you that. And I don't just mean the main girl, Lisa, is beautiful, because she is. But that's not, well, the corpse, the Frankenstein of the film, is pretty good looking for a corpse. Most of the people in this movie are pretty people, but also the set design, the dressing, the set pieces, the locations, the cinematography. It's a good looking film. Don't get me wrong, it is. It just doesn't look like 1989. It looks like 1986. When I saw the trailer for this and the poster, I assumed it was going to take place in 1986 because that's what it looks like. But it takes place in 1989. Now let's talk about the overall experience of the film. So this movie borrows heavily from 80s classics and a couple of 90s classics. It's got a very familiar 80s plot and vibe. It's very similar to Heathers in some of the plot. It's very similar to Edward Scissorhands and Encino Man. And it's also very similar to E.T. in a couple of points. Which, again, even Stranger Things draws on E.T., so you can't really fault the filmmaker because people think 80s, and for whatever reason they associate the 80s with E.T., even though that was literally only 1982, and by 1983, E.T. had caused the video game crash, and people were over E.T. by 1984, so, it is what it is. But, if you weren't there, you would know. So you have two movies taking place in this. And it is a horror film, and I'm going to get to that in a second. You have two movies. You have the love story, which is reminiscent to Heathers and Edward Scissorhands. And then you have the Fish Out of Water, which is reminiscent of E.T. and Encino Man. You have scenes that are lifted right out of all four of those movies. It's like the filmmaker who made this, and I don't know who they are, I haven't looked it up, just copy and pasted directly from those four movies. Now let's talk about the horror aspects of this movie. The basic subplot, and I don't want to spoil the movie too much, is Lisa, through a wish, resurrects a corpse. And she spends the movie, we'll say, beautifying the corpse. But her and the corpse also, Heather style, let's just say they murder some people that are not friendly to Lisa. And that's the plot of the movie, the basic plot of the movie. There are some genuine, heartfelt moments. And there's even a couple of moments that reminded me of Short Circuit, I forgot to mention. So again, this movie's all over the place. And I want to be clear, that's not necessarily a bad thing. it's got a good 80s vibe, and if you're into 80s vibes, this movie works. Like I said, it's a little anachronistic to me, so as I was watching it, I was kind of thinking about that the whole time. So I'm going to watch this movie again to give it a fair shake. But my recommendation, if you're wondering, is this is absolutely a buy. It's more than worth your time. You will enjoy this movie. I enjoyed it a lot. I just want to be clear that it's not a perfect movie, and I had issues with it. And I like to put the issues up front before I get into the things I liked. So, one thing I liked about this movie is the ending. It has a very tragic but also heartfelt ending, and I like the ending. It's a tragic story, like the source material, the movies it's ripping off, and I'm going to say ripping off because it is blatantly ripping off Edward Scissorhands, for sure. But this is a fucking much better film than Edward Scissorhands. That movie can eat shit. I've already reviewed it. I hate that movie. This movie I don't hate. I actually liked this movie. I enjoyed it. I don't do star ratings, and the reason I don't do star ratings is because they're meaningless. If I gave one movie 3 stars and another movie 4 stars, how are you going to know, is this something you should buy or something you should just watch one time? You know what I mean? Star ratings don't tell you anything. But a rent or a buy is a more useful rating, in my opinion, because rent means, alright, watch it and move on, and a buy means own it and rewatch it. So, you know, some movies are better than others, obviously, but to me that's the threshold. Is it worth rewatching? And this movie is worth rewatching. Because you're going to go back and you know, look for the Easter eggs, because there are, and try to figure out the references and the influences, and you're just going to enjoy the throwback. Now, I liken it to the Goldbergs in that it has that any era 80s aesthetic, you know, where it could be any year in the 80s. The thing I like about the Goldbergs is he says every episode it was 1980 something. He's not very specific or clear with the year, and that show's very anachronistic. It'll show things that, you know, he did that took place in 84, and then later it'll show him doing things, new things, you know, later seasons that happened in 82, etc. So it's a very anachronistic TV show. But I'm okay with it because it's a kid telling stories from his childhood. They're going to get jumbled in his memory. This is supposed to be a first-hand account of what happened. You know, it's not told through flashbacks or narrative or a journal or a diary or anything like that. We're watching it unfold allegedly as it happened in 1989, which takes me out of the movie because this isn't... In a small town in Kansas, yeah, it takes the styles a little longer to move forward. So, in 1992, in Nowhere, Kansas, it still looks like 1987 because it takes longer for the fashions to trickle down. But this takes place in a city. This takes place in an urban area, a big high school, where you have a lot of popular kids who are definitely in tune to what are the styles of the day, and they would not be dressing like somebody who dressed last year. That's not how teenagers operate. Teenagers are deathly terrified of not fitting in. And so you're not going to dress like it's 1986 in 1989. You're not going to, because of fear of being ostracized. And now the girl, Lisa, is not a popular girl, but she's not an unpopular girl either. She later becomes labeled as a freak, because there's a subplot with her mom being murdered, and so there's that going along. And she does have her goth... They refer to it as her goth phase, although she doesn't look very goth to me, but whatever. This movie definitely... Whoever made this movie definitely is a fan of Tim Burton, because there is heavy Tim Burton influences in this movie. I am not a fan of Tim Burton, so that's one of the reasons why I wanted to point out some of the nitpicky stuff, because, you know, if you're going to rip off anybody from the 80s, please don't rip off Tim Burton. Rip off anybody else. Fucking John Carpenter, even though I'm not a fan of John Carpenter. I would rather you rip him off than Tim Burton. But I digress. This is a fun movie. It's an enjoyable movie. It's a pretty movie. It's an interesting movie. It's a heartfelt movie. It's worth a watch or 3. It's worth rewatching. And it's worth owning. I definitely highly recommend this movie. But I want to be, you know, I want to be upfront with you, you know, because I do that in these videos. I try to be upfront. I try to give you the, here's the business, This is the things I liked, these are the things I didn't like. And I like to give my reasons behind them, which means sometimes these videos get a little rambly. That being said, if they had set this movie in 1986, I would have enjoyed it even more, because I would have been like, hell yeah, that's 1986. But because they said it in 1989, I'm like, oh God, were you alive in the 80s? Are you getting your info from YouTube? So that's the only reason why I nitpick, and I want to use the word nitpick. I'm not harping, I'm not bitching, I'm not complaining, I'm nitpicking. So does it take me out of the movie? A little bit, but not to the point where I can't enjoy the movie, but enough that I have to mention it, because there's a lot of 80s throwback movies that do it right. They know, our movie's set in 1983, let's study everything from 1983. Let's look at yearbooks, let's look at, magazine articles, let's look at local newscasts, let's look at home videos and pictures kids took of at the mall, and let's look at movies that were made in 1983 so we know what 1983 looked like. If you're going to set your movie in 1983, but it looks like 1988, you fucked up. That's all I'm saying. You missed the mark. It's the 80s was 10 whole years. None of the styles that you're familiar with in the 80s were the entire decade. Just like anything you're familiar with of the 70s or 90s wasn't the entire decade. Grunge was 1989 to 1992, and then it was over. But people think of the 90s, they think grunge. No, the 90s were not grunge. The first 2 years of the 90s were grunge, and then we moved on. Same thing with the 80s, There were different pockets. Same thing with the 2000s, same thing with the 2010s, same thing with today. And I have to mention this just as a final aside. Don't study Hollywood films, blockbusters, to get an idea of what the style was at the time. Because kids did not dress like they do in the movies. They never do. Kids don't have that kind of money. They don't have that kind of money for the makeup, for the hair, for the product, for the expensive designer clothes. Come on. That's why you have to look at yearbooks. You have to look at newspapers. You have to look at pictures that kids took, selfies kids took at the mall. Things like that, to get an idea of what the styles were like. Because Hollywood, go look at a movie that was made today, and then go to your local 7-Eleven and look at how people dress, and you're going to see that your regular, normal, everyday people are not dressed the same as the people you see in the movies. They just aren't. Hollywood and real life are separate. So if you're making a throwback movie and you want it to be a throwback to 80s movies, study 80s movies. If you're making a period piece and you want it to be accurate, then you got to dig a little deeper, is all I'm saying. I don't know if this movie was supposed to be an 80s movie throwback or a period piece. It feels like the throwback. It doesn't feel like a period piece to me. So just want to make that clear, because if you're not familiar with the 80s, I just want you to know that it is not all hot pink and neon and frizzy hair. That was literally only like 2 years of the 10 years that make up the decade. The hot pink was a big thing for like a couple of years, and then we moved on. But it didn't even start until the mid-80s. 82, 83, 81, there was no hot pink, there was no neon lights, there was no frizzy hair, there was no poodle skirts. That came later. Or I say poodle skirts, I mean poofy skirts. I mix those words up. You know what I'm trying to say. Just be more thoughtful, I guess, is all I'm saying. Stay cool.